Hey, are we live now? Look at that. Sorry for the technical difficulties. All right. If you are listening, if you're round two, if you're listening to this is the Right Rudder Marketing webinar series, not the podcast. But it's very similar. This is kind of an exclusive event. So if you are here with us today, on the audience side of things, if you're here, feel free to chat in here. On the right side is a chat box over there. You can ask any of us, me or Sebastian over here, if you have any questions about MOSAIC. We also have a wonderful panel that we're going to be shortly introducing. Some housekeeping stuff as well. So if you are a flight school and you need help growing and scaling your business, getting more enrollments, getting more butts and seats, check out rightruddermarketing.com, 314-804-1200, or info@rightruddermarketing.com. If you'd like to be a panelist or part of a podcast, please check us out as well, info@rightruddermarketing.com. All right. So I kind of rushed through the introduction since that was the second time I had to do it. But yeah, let's get started. So maybe, how do you want to do this? Want to introduce one at a time, maybe?
Yeah. So first, I just wanted to say that the idea for this came about when we were talking to lots of our flight school owners who fell into one of two categories, right? Vis-a-vis MOSAIC. Either they didn't actually understand everything that it meant. They knew that there were expanded privileges for sport pilots, but they weren't sure what else was involved. And then there were some other people, and there's definitely overlap in these two categories, that are concerned, right, about safety, about moving too fast, about lowering the bar. So that's why we wanted to convene here to have a panel with people who are qualified to speak on it. We have EAA in the house. In the wake of EAA Oshkosh just a couple weeks ago, when Part 2 of MOSAIC went into effect, we have, flight school owners that are operating LSAs, and we have new innovators that in some ways were enabled by MOSAIC, but don't let me speak for them. Let's do a little quick round of introductions, maybe going from Tom. Hey, Hans, welcome back. We're going to go Tom, Hans, then Lute and Elliott. If you get a quick introduction, as well as how your organization was involved with or affected by MOSAIC, that'd be great for our audience to understand.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Tom Charpentier. I'm Government Relations Director here at EAA. And the EAA Advocacy and Safety team led a lot of the advocacy that led to the publication and passage of MOSAIC, along with a lot of other groups and organizations out there.
How about you, Hans?
Hello, everyone. My name is Hans Laitinen. I am the sales and delivery representative for the certified Part 22 RVs that come off the factory line here. As a member of VANS, I take orders for the factory-built Part 22 airplanes, now MOSAIC. And VANS Aircraft has had a big hand in the MOSAIC rule, being a big part of the ASTM committee, collecting all the rules and basically helping write the rules in partnership with manufacturers and many others, and the FAA to get this rule adopted. And then right away, we're having impact on our airplane capabilities and what we're allowed to do as far as building and delivering factory-built flyaway airplanes.
Excellent. Can't wait to learn more about it. Thank you for joining us. Lute, how about you, sir?
Lute Atieh, Northwest Missouri, Flytech Pilot Academy and ATD pilot training and ATD air charter. And we've got, about 21 aircrafts, and one of those aircrafts is a MOSAIC-eligible lights. I guess it's a special light sport that we've been testing for a few years. And so, like other flight school owners, looking, evaluating, and wondering what the next aircrafts we might purchase might be. And so we're staying very in tune to this.
Excellent. Looking forward to hearing your advice for flight school owners. And finally, Elliott, what do we got going on?
Hi, my name is Elliott Seguin. I'm an experimental test pilot currently working for Aerospace, but I've been working in developing research and development aircraft and aircraft products for 20 years, going all the way back to SpaceShipTwo. And whether we're talking about spin-resistant airframes and the work that I did for ICON in terms of traditional static stability in the context of spin resistance, or we're talking about the work I did for Skyryse, making an R66 fly-by-wire single lever control with envelope protection, the result is the same. There's lots of new technology, and 22 represents a formal way for those guys to get into the market.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining us. And so, like I said earlier, we want to get into the specifics of how MOSAIC affects flight school owners, how it could potentially affect their business models, their fleet decisions, even their bottom line, as well as safety considerations. But first, we need to clear up that first part. What is MOSAIC really, right? Like, what does it mean in addition to expanded privileges for sport pilots? And Tom, I'd like to address you first and ask you, for all of our flight school owners and aviation professionals in the audience, what is MOSAIC? What was the problem that it set out to fix? And specifically, what is new in this second part that went live this July 24th?
Okay, great question. So let's start all the way back in 2004 when the original light sport and sport pilot rules first came out. And if anybody was around back then, you'll remember that was originally a rule that was meant to support kind of the lighter end of general aviation. People who wanted to train to fly ultralights. We wanted to have a pathway to be able to do things like 2-seat weight shift control aircraft and stuff like that. But the end result of it, particularly for fixed wing aircraft, leveraged a standard that actually went pretty far beyond just those really, really light aircraft. It went all the way up to, at the time, this was quite a generous number, 1,320 pounds. That was kind of the fundamental limitation of the aircraft at the time. So that was a rule that allowed aircraft to be produced, and really for the first time ever, not be kind of these rigid Part 23 standards that the FAA had, but actually have industry set consensus standards that aircraft could be built to. So it really got the FAA as far out of the certification process as possible at the time. I mean, they're still involved with accepting the standards, auditing manufacturers, things like that. But it reduced that kind of regulatory overhead to a minimal level. And then it also created the sport pilot and sport pilot instructor certificates, which particularly the sport pilot certificate has been a real boon for the lighter end of general aviation. People are going through and getting their sport pilot certificates, from the start, which is saving them money and creating an affordable way of getting into general aviation. And it also allows people who don't want to maintain a traditional FAA medical certificate a pathway to continue flying. So it went along for, 15 or 20 years, and it was a smashing success. I mean, there was a lot of opportunities that we then identified for being able to go take the next step, right? And that's what MOSAIC does. So it takes the success of the original 2004 sport pilot and light sport rules, and it modernizes them and expands them. Fundamentally, I think this is important to understand, fundamentally what it did, the original sport pilot and light sport rules, they were linked to a single definition of a light sport aircraft. So there was a definition in part 1.1 that said, this is what a light sport aircraft is. And it was, 2 seats, 1,300 for fixed wing, 2 seats, 1,320 pounds, stall speed of, I think, 45 knots, clean. There was a top speed that you couldn't exceed and a couple of other things. The FAA, that was kind of a limitation for both the pilot and also the aircraft, because we always knew we could build an aircraft that went a little bit beyond that, but not everybody at the FAA was comfortable allowing a sport pilot to fly that type of aircraft. So what the FAA did was they delinked the pilot certification rule and the aircraft certification rule. So now sport pilot is just another rating. It's a rating that you can receive to fly aircraft that meet the eligibility standards that are in the sport pilot rules. So there's kind of a list of things that a sport pilot can fly that's in 91.316, I think. It kind of goes through everything you could do. And then now we also have Part 22, which is the new home of the updated light sport aircraft. And that greatly expands what manufacturers can build. There's basically no weight limit anymore. Well, there isn't a weight limit anymore. You could go all the way up to 61 knots dirty stall speed. So stall speed and landing configuration. The limitations, I'm sure Elliott's going to talk about this, the limitations on type and number of engines has been eliminated. So we now have, twins coming down the pike that can be certified as a light sport aircraft. Again, a sport pilot wouldn't necessarily be able to fly it, but we do have these kinds of aircraft coming into the market. So it really unleashes the aircraft manufacturing community to be able to build aircraft that kind of have a appropriate level of certification, oversight, and overhead, but greatly reduces those costs. So I think that's
Thanks so
probably
much.
the best summary I could give you, just to kind of set the table. I'm sure we'll talk about plenty more nuts and bolts as we go along.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. Very comprehensive. Do you want to tackle this next one, Tim, here? Writing off
Yeah.
what Tom was saying?
I suppose so. Got a list of questions here that I have not rehearsed yet. So,
Okay.
All right. So we're looking at the headline change of this weight limit being gone. It's now having being replaced by a stall speed. So why do you think that, limiting, or I guess categorizing aircraft as light sport via stall speed is better than, say, a weight limit?
And this one maybe goes to Hans, since, you're on the manufacturing side.
Yeah, I am
go
a
ahead.
little bit, but Tom, you're welcome to jump in as well. But I think basically what they've done is look at the safety data of the light sport aircraft compared to experimental, compared to Car 3 certified, compared to Part 23 certified, and they found that the light sport aircraft and the limitations that they put on it, that the safety data was actually highly successful. That the whole category was a very safe category, and they wanted to expand that, and that they moved to the SOL numbers as a better marker than the other limitations, which were less good at specifying what a safe aircraft could be under that certification.
Yeah, I think I would say that the original weight limit was made sense at the time. It was based on a European standard. If you want to know what 1,320 pounds is, that's 600 kilograms. And again, that worked for the time, but it as things progressed, it became clear that that was kind of an arbitrary standard, and that there were other things that were a better predictor of aircraft, of a safe aircraft, a controllable, something that a beginner pilot would be able to fly, and stall speed was what they settled on for that. Yep.
Gotcha.
Kind of followed up on, I think it was Tom that was mentioning that there's going to be an expansion of the sports category. Is that right word, category or class? I'm not sure. I know pilots get really screwy with this one. Types and categories and classes are a very touchy word. But a sport pilot or sport characteristic, aircraft. You mentioned potentially a multi-engine aircraft and, larger capability. But obviously that's kind of different than the sport pilots being flying these planes. So is there any benefit of creating a sport multi-engine plane if, private pilots and instrument pilots are the ones that can really fly this plane? I don't really understand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that really goes, and again, Hans, feel free to jump in here, but I think that really goes to the strength of the rule, is that and the opportunity that exists within the rule, right? So yeah, we have expanded sport pilot privileges, and I probably should have been a little clearer about that up front. So now a sport pilot can fly anything up to 59 knots clean, 4 seats. You could have retractable landing gear and a constant speed prop with appropriate exemptions, endorsements, and things like that. So now a sport pilot will be able to fly pretty much anything that's on your typical flight school, well, any primary trainer that's on your typical flight school flight line. But the real beauty of this for expanding light sport aircraft is that this is where the next generation of trainers are going to come from. I mean, if you need a multi-engine trainer now, there's going to be aircraft on the market that, again, are coming into the market at minimal certification overhead. There's still plenty of manufacturing costs, liability costs, things like that do drive up the cost of aircraft. But for everybody complaining that certification costs are out of control, well, this is about as low as we can make it.
Yeah, just to add a little bit onto that, at the top, you mentioned, one of the first things you mentioned was that now manufacturers have the ability to innovate more, that this really opens up innovation, because obviously the previous rule, it was the weight limit, it was this speed and that speed, and there was all these specifications as well as the actual manufacturing standards. And now it has, there's still 4,000 some odd requirements under the new rule, but now it's just the stall speed that actually limits the capabilities of the aircraft. So it really allows manufacturers to expand and innovate into this rule, and there's a whole bunch of possibilities as far as number of engines, or even helicopters, rotorcraft, all types of aircraft can fit and be certified under this rule. And it's really detached. Before it was the light sport aircraft and the sport pilot were very much attached to each other. The sport pilots could fly light sport aircraft. Now that's very much separate. Sport pilots have their own, it's its own kind of, private pilot light certification. And then you have a much broader light sport aircraft category that is, like you mentioned, less expensive to certify as compared to like Car 3 or Part 23 aircraft.
Right. So I think it's helpful. So we kind of already got this going already, but let's kind of separate this out, because there are two parts of MOSAIC, right? You have the pilot side of it, then you have the aircraft manufacturer side of it. So
Right.
I think it was Tom that kind of went over a little brief overview of like maybe the sport pilot stuff. So I think that kind of affects flight schools more, at least in the short term, affects their flight schools a little bit more so than the aircraft manufacturers, which will probably roll in in a couple of years, because is that right?
However, I do have one thing that I wanted to say, and I did want to bring in Lute and Elliott for this one, because you talked about less certification overhead, Tom. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about how that affects you guys directly. Lute as, a current trainer, and Elliott as an innovator in the space who's trying to revolutionize towards the future. So for Lute, what does it mean for you to have these new trainers that you can use actually all purpose? Go ahead and take it from there.
Yeah, from me, if we look at the consumer side of things, these newer aircrafts and this new technology, they're good looking airplanes. And when you're having a conversation with a parent, putting their teenager inside of an airplane, and it's like what I flew in to train versus a brand new Vans or a brand new Sling, or these things are sexy. It's the perception of the perception of quality, like anything else, kind of leans towards the newer, shinier things. But the technology, right? If we're teaching these young kids how to fly and we want to keep their attention, the technology used in today's, newer MOSAIC plane is really, really effective. And from what I've read, actually does make for a safer flight. Not to say there's anything wrong with learning on a 6-pack with carb heat. I did it. I still make students do it at our school, even if they train in a glass cockpit. We force the 6-pack and the carb heat and the mixture. So it's good for sales. It's great for operational efficiency. It's a little messy right now with multiple types in a fleet, but again, we're all at the beginning of this here. We're learning. We're trying to understand. Do we make the whole switch, or do we phase it in and annoy our maintenance department with 2 or 3 different aircraft types in the meantime? So, but initial response, I've had mine for almost 2 years. We're pushing 1,800 hours. We're talking Rotax engine. We're talking all. We've graduated a handful of sport certificate holders. So far, so good. I don't really have anything negative to say yet. It's more time will tell, but that's my take.
And is there my last question relating again to what Tom said about the certification overhead, the costs associated with certification and reducing those, does that make its way into your bottom line? Also, what about the operating costs of the aircraft, stuff like that?
Well, I think it makes its way to the cost of the aircraft. I bought this thing brand new for a third of what I could buy today's 172 for, and then never mind the weight. So it helps. It trickles down to our bottom line. That trickles down to what we pay for the aircraft, and then obviously this new technology. We've got engine monitoring that's built in, wireless engine monitor. It's just amazing the kind of data you can get out of these newer aircrafts because of the tech. And so, yes.
Excellent. Okay, thanks for that. And I have a similar question for Elliott. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you guys are doing at BI with the electric trainer, and what role MOSAIC has played in enabling that innovation?
Yeah, sure. The eFlyer 2 is the first all-electric training aircraft designed to be certified. And so the marketing pitch is that the energy costs alone could represent massive savings in terms of the operating costs of the aircraft, right? We're all familiar with Tesla electric cars and the relative cost of driving, for instance, my F-350 versus driving a Tesla. And the idea is to pass that on to the consumer. I think if you were to expand that, just one step back, fundamentally the issue with electric aircraft is energy storage or energy available on takeoff stored in the aircraft. And if you were to look at how that problem plays out, there's a sort of from initial adoption of electric to final adoption of electric. The final adoption would be things that take off vertically, things that fly across the Pacific with hauling freight, or fighters, right? Aircraft that use a lot of energy. But if you slide that scale all the way to the left, you're looking at where would the first adoption of electric be? I've worked programs that were hybrid electric, where you're doing short haul freight runs with gasoline backup between, say, islands in Scotland or the islands in Hawaii, where we're sort of taking advantage of electric, but we're not hit so hard by the energy storage problem. Training represents an even more lucrative, potentially, first use for electric, because we're taking off and landing at the same airport, number one. And number two, you're not limited by, for instance, if you're trying to sell a Mooney, how far the range number shows on the POH, but you're limited by the attention span of the student, which we've all experienced is sort of on the order of 45 minutes to an hour and 15. So it ends up being maybe potentially the best place for the electric aircraft nut to be cracked open. And it could be really exciting both for this particular industry and for electric in general.
And then pointing to MOSAIC one more time, because, we spoke at Oshkosh. I asked you, hey, did MOSAIC have any part to play, in enabling you guys to develop this aircraft? And, I think you said something pretty positive about it.
Yeah, so I think BAI has the advantage of having existed for 20 years, and they've had to try to design initially to the Part 23 standard. So in the context of BAI, what Part 22 represents is a chance to shortcut that. So all of the ground testing, the manufacturing audits, et cetera, can be shortcut, or at least we believe can be significantly shortcut by taking a step on the way to 23 at 22 and getting to the market a lot faster. As we all know, startups are limited by the amount of investor cash you can round up before you start. That runway is only so long. And so getting those first 50 ship sets out becomes critical, and 22 should be a less intensive way to get through the certification path. And I think that's that sort of, like we talked about at Oshkosh, what's so exciting about 22 is it sort of feels like a change in posture from the regulatory body. I've been working in R&D for, like I said, 20 years, and it's always the constant thing that comes up either from investors or from management, how are we possibly going to get this thing certified? 23 is so onerous, like what is the path? And 22, while it's still maybe being defined, but it represents a change in posture by the regulatory body to say, we're going to figure out how to bring in these new techs. Right now with BAI, we're talking about just simply taking a relatively conventional aircraft and sticking an electric motor on the front. But if we talk about what's really possible, right? You look at like a Tesla car. When it came to market, it was presented to us, the consumers, as, oh, it's an electric car. But really what it brought was networking between vehicles and self-driving and perhaps having the system get between the steering wheel and the tires on the ground. Well, the same thing's true with eVTOL. Trillions of dollars have now been spent developing these vertical takeoff electric vehicles. Now, as we mentioned, vertical takeoff is probably the last place that electric will actually come into the market. But with the eVTOLs, with the Jobies, with the Betas, et cetera, comes networking between vehicles, envelope protection, throttle by wire, energy management through a third party, between the pilot's hand on the throttle and the thruster on the outside of the vehicle. These are technologies that we can take on very soon, and Part 22 gives us a path to bring those technologies in sooner than later, both to lower the bar for who can become pilots and also raise the safety.
Lower the bar and raise the safety. We're going to have to remember that one for later when we start bringing up some of the concerns that we've heard in the flight training industry. But before that, what I'm hearing you express so passionately, Elliott, is that you feel that MOSAIC is helping usher in the future of aviation. I'd love to ask Tom kind of whether that was part of the intention, and also as a sub question of that, where flight training organizations sort of land within the whole design of MOSAIC and what it means for the future.
Sure, I can cover a few of those things. So it absolutely was designed with the future in mind. It was designed to really unleash the industry in the lighter end of general aviation. The FAA uses something they call the safety continuum to try to determine what level of certification to apply to different aircraft, and kind of at the top of that is your scheduled airline service, your Part 25 aircraft, which obviously has an extremely high demand of safety, expectation of safety by the general public. And there's a lot of very explicit regulation on that aircraft as kind of a result of that. And then it kind of proceeds from there. So the FAA really tries to have an appropriate level of oversight for the kind of the at-large public's expectation of that safety oversight. That doesn't necessarily mean that aircraft lower on the safety continuum are less safe, just that they have less of a explicit safety oversight from the FAA, right? So MOSAIC really helped to kind of right size that for the lighter end of general aviation. General public doesn't necessarily put a ton of attention into, how the FAA regulates something like an RV-12. They do put a lot of attention into how they regulate something like, 737 MAX or something like that. So that's the way that was intended to be done by FAA. Now, when you talk about where flight schools fall into this, so there's a couple of very interesting opportunities for flight schools out there. So first of all, obviously the aircraft, right? This will, like I said before, this will hopefully be the next generation of training aircraft. Lute just mentioned, we're already seeing real world results in terms of cheaper aircraft coming in the light sport world. But in terms of the pilots and the instructors that you have coming in, so for pilots, for anybody who's seeking to fly recreationally, Sport Pilot has suddenly become a very, very viable option, right? Sport Pilot will now allow you to fly pretty much any of your light GA trainer / touring aircraft, kind of like up to the level of something about around the size of a 182, Cessna 182. So that's quite a bit of airplane that you can fly now as a Sport Pilot. Now, at an appropriate level of training and endorsements. The Sport Pilot rule allows for somebody to become a pilot. The FAA minimum is 20 hours. Nobody hits that, of course. But it does allow for a pilot to become a safe certificated pilot in a lower number of with a lower number of hours and explicit requirements. We have a Sport Pilot Academy here at EAA. We run in RV-12s out of Oshkosh. We've been getting people through. Now, that's an intensive program, but we've been able to get people through in under 40 hours. There is also another real-world example. There's a flight school here in Wisconsin that uses Cubs, and they fly out of a non-towered field. So it's kind of like the purest, like barnstorming, type of flying that you can do as a brand new student. And one of the advantages of Sport Pilot is that a lot of the things that a private pilot just gets automatically are actually add-on endorsements for a Sport Pilot. And if you don't want to necessarily do those things, you don't have to. So one of those things is flying into a towered field. So they fly, out of their non-towered field in Cubs. And they're getting people out the door in less than 40 hours. So, for somebody like me, when I came into aviation and just wanted to fly for fun and, had not a ton of money in my pocket, that becomes a very viable option. And you could do a lot, maybe 80% of what you want to do in general aviation just with a Sport Pilot certificate, depending on the person, right?
Absolutely.
And then also, just one other thing to note is the Sport Pilot instructor rule. So that is a kind of an oft ignored rule that's been on the books since 2004, but has also suddenly become a lot more useful. A Sport Pilot instructor, you can pick up that certificate without the prerequisites of an instrument rating or a commercial certificate, and it allows you to teach sport pilots. So if Sport Pilot becomes as popular as we certainly hope it will be, the Sport Pilot instructor certificate will become a fairly useful certificate. And what that will enable is not necessarily like the professional career track CFI. That's still going to be a traditional CFI certificate. But what it will enable is people who are enthusiastic pilots, maybe have quite a bit of experience, but don't really want to go down that career track, don't want to invest the money in those advanced ratings, but they'll pick up the instructor certificate and they'll give back, on weekends, flying out of the flight school and stuff like that. I had instructors that were kind of fit that description when I learned to fly, and those are some of the best instructors out there because they really teach for the love of flying, and they're reliable and dependable, day in, day out. Anytime that they have time at the airport, they're out there on weekends instructing and things like that. So that's an instructor cadre that could serve flight schools very well in the future.
Absolutely. I do want to point one thing out, though, which is that, again, and to Tim's point from earlier, we're not just talking about sport pilots either, right? Like, Lute, we were talking, and your focus is really career-minded pilots, right? You're not going too hard in a sport, or, okay, oh, I want to hear your take, but I know that you do a lot of career training and that you're still very invested in MOSAIC.
Yeah, no, I think we look at it as two different markets. So obviously the majority of our students are career focused, but as I mentioned, I think it's 3 or 4 sport pilots we've produced already this year. And so what we've been told is that many flight schools don't really know how to answer the question when they get the phone call about sport. We did the research early on, obviously, and we've benefited from that. So what was the question again?
Well, I guess my point is that MOSAIC affects your career training program as well, right? With recent, like, you can have IMC capable sort of all-purpose trainers. All of a sudden, the hero becomes viable on your slings.
That's right. Yeah, that up to now we can't fly, in the clouds, and so we use the 172 for actual instrument training. But now this is good. This fixes that problem, and it allows us to continue diving into new modern aircrafts for our flight training. I'm excited about it because, Elliott talked about energy earlier. Just a fuel cost alone. If we were not going to add a surcharge to fuel to our student, that increase alone over the last year would bankrupt most flight schools. Right, us included. So it's just not This is not sustainable. The fuel cost at some of our fields is $7.50 a gallon in some fields, and other locations that we operate at $6.25 a gallon. It's absurd. Now my LSA, guess what my fuel rate is on that? Because I'm burning a hybrid of 91-100. It's under 4.
4 gallons an hour. 4 gallons an hour.
4 gallons an hour. I just at some point, whether we like it or not, we're all going to be forced. Yeah. Even the ones that don't like it, to take it seriously. I love it. I've been doing it for 2 years, and I'm a big fan.
Yeah. So one of the things that was kind of mentioned and kind of talked in briefly here, the sport pilot stuff, there's the sport CFI. There's one aspect of it. There's also the sport pilot himself. And I think it was kind of glossed over when they said it's very similar to, and a lot of privileges are there. You can get endorsements and all that type of stuff. Night flying. So one of the things that I think one of the biggest, I guess, marketable aspects of sport pilot, which I don't really agree with, but it's you don't necessarily need to get a medical for sport pilot. Now if you want to fly at night, however, you do need a medical. Isn't this correct? So you need a medical, and you also need or basic med if you have that, but you need to have that in place before you can even get the endorsement to fly at nighttime. So there is limitations for that. Also, like constant speed prop stuff. It's not necessarily a constant speed prop. It's like a prop controlled by a single control surface. I forget the legalese of this, but for example, a Diamond, or a Cirrus, they have that one, FADEC lever here that you don't need an endorsement for that for sport pilot, if I'm not mistaken. But if you have the blue knob, you do need the endorsement. So, and now getting endorsements on here too. So let's say you're a sport CFI and you're just working in your flight school and you're having a good time. And then, I don't know, let's say there's a, private pilot student pilot, not a private pilot, not instrument or anything like that. But he's working on his private pilot, not his sport pilot. And he needs to get, say, an endorsement to do his cross country. Well, you as a sport pilot CFI can endorse him, but then that cross country will only work for the requirements of the sport pilot certificate, not for the private pilot certificate. So you really can't, endorse. So let's say you endorse a tailwheel guy. Well, if you endorse a tailwheel guy, he can only fly a tailwheel flying under sport pilot certifications. So he might be a private pilot or even a commercial pilot, but if you as a CFIS endorse me, let's say I'm commercial, whatever, and this new CFI, he's a sport pilot, whatever, he endorsed me for tailwheel. Well, I can only fly a tailwheel under sport pilot certifications, not under private, not under commercial, not under ATP. Is that correct? I don't know if it's right.
Yes, so you brought up actually a an interpretation that the FAA just recently put out. They won't call it an interpretation because they say it's been this way forever, but that does limit the sports CFI certificate. So I can quickly cover that. Yes, first of all, you're right with the other endorsement language. So it's kind of something that's unique to Sport Pilot. If you have a blue knob, you need an endorsement for that. If you have retracts, you need an endorsement for that. Or if you happen to have a complex endorsement, that covers both of them. Yes, the Sport Pilot CFI certificate. So it was always limited to, if you're training somebody ab initio, it's limited to the Sport Pilot certificate. The dual that you log with a Sport Pilot CFI is applicable to higher ratings as long as you get the Sport Pilot certificate first. So if you use Sport Pilot as a stepping stone to private, that works out fine. But a Sport Pilot CFI cannot train toward the requirements of a private pilot certificate on its own. For flight school owners out there, I think you can understand why that makes a certain amount of sense. There's a certain amount of fairness in that, right? You don't want necessarily sports CFIs undercutting traditional CFIs in the pipeline. Now, this interpretation the FAA put out goes a little bit beyond that. It says that a sports CFI, when they endorse or give a flight review to a higher rated pilot, that endorsement or flight review is limited to Sport Pilot privileges. That's already caused a few issues out in the field because that was not standard operating practice for some people out there, some folks out there, and to our understanding, it wasn't really the way that things were working either. And also, in EAA's opinion, that should probably be rolled back. If I gave you, as a sports CFI, if I gave you a tail wheel endorsement in a J3 Cub, how is that much different than a tail wheel endorsement that a traditional CFI gives you in a J3 Cub? And for the traditional CFI, that endorsement is going to cover you all the way up to flying a B-17 commercially or something like that. So, there's some stuff we got to work on from an advocacy perspective there. But yeah, fundamentally, the Sport Pilot CFI certificate, when you're talking about training for a rating, is limited to the Sport Pilot certificate.
I think another thing to mention as well too is like you do all this training for Sport Pilot, and I am playing the devil's advocate here. I'm playing the bad cop here. You do all this work, and then one of the biggest challenges is is there a flight school available that can help me with this? So I'm glad that Lute's in that team, But a lot of other flight schools are not, they're kind of kicking them away. And the second, part of it is if you do find a flight school and a plane to train in, is actually getting a DPE to do your exam. So how many DPEs are out there that can do Sport Pilot? I mean, this has got to be pretty low. And I just bring this up because Mary, by the way, and I know Mary on a first-hand basis, Mary's shoe. She put in the chat, by the way. So if you are listening and you want to put some comments in here, if you want to do anything want to ask the panelists questions, go to the right of your screen. There should be a button for chat. Mary is a DPE and she's based off the West Coast and she has some experience in RV-12. So if anyone needs help, that was her email, by the way, maryshoeaviation@gmail.com. So I bring that up because is it, for a flight school owner, we're looking at it from a business perspective. Like, is this worth even pursuing? I think that's what the number one question is on most flight schools' minds is it even worth pursuing, opening this up to, getting more aircraft that are Sport Pilot MOSAIC eligible? Is it worth offering programs for students to do Sport Pilot? I think this might be more targeted towards Lute as he has real knowledge on the ground here. But that's kind of the main concern that I've heard in the industry is that a lot of flight schools just want to, they want to have a 20-foot pole away from this thing because they don't want it to get in trouble. And they don't want to, be flying people without a medical and all that type of stuff. So I don't know. That's kind of what I hear from the other side of the fence.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. It's not that difficult, from a flight school perspective. There's ground school specifically for sport. There's, it's, it reminds me of when the associate's degree started becoming more popular and, everybody poo-pooed that. And then this is the associate's degree on the way to the bachelor's. You used to have to pick one or the other. And now everybody, me, myself included, some people have both. You get your associates and then you get your bachelor's, because how many of us have seen people that have stopped training because of a life event or something, and they stopped training at like 35 or 40 hours. And it's like, man, you could have already had something to show for that time and effort. and that'll keep you going. And then, yes, you'll probably upgrade to a private naturally or organically, but it's not difficult at all. It's just a little bit of reading and research. You don't have to change much, if anything. And the ground school curriculum already exists. So your CFIs just follow that with the student. And again, you're missing some controlled airspace, some night stuff, and a handful of other things that I can't remember. And that's it. The rest is the same. We're flying airplanes.
But, I also just wanted to make sure that everybody understood, and please correct me if I'm wrong, right? Because every time we talk about MOSAIC, we go first to Sport Pilot, we talk about Sport Pilot ratings and stuff like that. But it also means that career-minded students that never get their Sport Pilot, they start at a PPL and they go all the way to the airlines, they can also take advantage of MOSAIC aircraft, and flight schools can take advantage of the lower operating costs of the modern avionics, and they can pass some of those lower operating costs to the students. So you could be making a better margin and also charging the student less. And as we know, cost is probably the most prohibitive factor for many people in the flight training space, both the operators and the students. So that's why I keep kind of coming back to this point. I want to make sure that everybody knows that, because I know for a fact that there are people who think that it only has to do with Sport Pilot rating. Do you know what I mean, Lou? Am I wrong in anything that I'm saying here?
You're right. Yeah, there's really two parts, and we intermix them a lot. But the light sport aircraft, amazing, great, right? It's going to keep costs low for most people who are going to stay into that. The Sport Pilot, great. I have maybe 80% of the hours that I've flown in my life would have fallen under that category. And I didn't really need that third person in the plane until I had children, which is in the last 10 years. So great on both ends.
Yeah.
I was about to say, like, it's okay for the Sport Pilot certification stuff, and not only certification, but privileges, flying under Sport Pilot privileges. You can be an ATP pilot, but let's say you might be retired or you stop flying, commercially or for higher compensation. You don't necessarily need to renew your medical anymore. You can just fly with a driver's license. You can let your medical lapse. You don't need to go basic med even. You can just take a driver's license, and now you can fly, Cessna 172 under Sport Pilot privileges. I'm waving this magic wand here. It's like, hey, I'm going to apply to Sport Pilot privileges, man.
If you can find one and afford a 172 and find one, good luck, because they're tough to find.
Cool.
Well, I really want to talk a little bit about the future. Maybe Hans and Elliott both have, Hans, obviously you guys are manufacturing. I think you guys were the first to deliver a MOSAIC aircraft, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously, Elliott, you're thinking about the future. You're thinking about electric, hybrid electric stuff. So to the two of you, I want to ask you what you think the future of the flight training space is, especially in terms of fleet selection. Mm-hmm. And then I want Tim to grill you, because, I know he's got some concerns, and he can represent some concerns from people like him who are flying Piper Cherokees, Cessna 172s with the analog 6-pack. So, what is your guys' vision? And then let's have Tim subject it to, his critiques for a little bit.
Yeah, I'll jump in first if you don't mind, Elliott. And a lot of the things, first of all, the first thing we're seeing right away is there's a whole bunch of manufacturers that are taking their light sport aircraft that were certified under the new rule and updating them pretty quickly under MOSAIC and getting more capability. And we were the first with the RV-12. We've delivered 2 MOSAIC RV-12s now. To my knowledge, those are the only 2 MOSAIC certified airplanes in existence right now still. But there's a whole bunch that are right around the corner. I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the month there were many, many more than just 2 MOSAIC airplanes out there. But it does mean that there's more capability being gained right away. And it would, in the case of the RV-12, most notably the ability to fly in IMC. We have seen from flight schools the hesitancy or choice to go a different direction or just stick with legacy aircraft. The biggest complaints or worries have been the restrictions of the old light sport aircraft category with the weight limits, with the speed limits. They've received the technology as far as engines and avionics very well with the low fuel burn and the glass cockpits. There are many professional minded students and pilots who do want or even require glass cockpits for their initial training or commercial ticket. And so having something that is modern is really important to them, having the glass cockpit. But what it also means for us moving forward and looking at the future is we can now build any of the RVs under the new rule. previously we could only build the RV-12. That was the only one that we could build as a light sport aircraft. Moving forward, we could build all the way up to the RV-10, our 4-seat aircraft that has a 260 horsepower engine on it. That's gonna be able to be built under this new rule too. And so you're gonna have the ability to, in the past, if you're looking at an airplane for, to get an airplane with that kind of performance, you had to build it, you had to have it built for you, and go through that process. And now you're going to, with this new rule, you're going to be able to get performance like that from a flyaway airplane that doesn't have the overhead costs of a Car 3 or Part 23 airplane. So being able to get an airplane for a much, much lower cost with that performance is what we can look forward to.
Much. How about you, Elliott? What are your thoughts for the future of flight training?
So for me, it all comes down to envelope protection. So effectively, really goes back to the 70s with the spin-resistant aircraft push, and the idea that you could make an aircraft that was so benign in a stall that it actually couldn't depart. And it was Cirrus's attempt to go after that resulted in the fuselage parachute, or the whole airplane parachute, which ends up being, this sort of technology that we get our wives excited about flying in the airplanes. With Garmin Autoland, the whole nut blew open, right? So basically with Garmin Autoland, you could effectively, depending on what safety factors you're willing to accept, take your off the shelf autopilot, that's in a lot of these aircraft anyway, and you could limit the envelope of the aircraft. So for instance, you could say anything beyond 45 degrees, the pilot's doing something wrong, and we're just not going to let him do that anymore. And you can take that and you can shrink the whole envelope down and dramatically get rid of some of the risks that we are trying to teach our students to manage digitally, and without a lot of cost, both in terms of the electronics you have to put in the aircraft and the weight that you have to haul around in order to make these systems happen. And so with that, with simplified vehicle operations comes a dramatically different way of thinking about aviating. Now, we could back up and we could say, well, isn't that just autonomous? Isn't that just having a person along for the ride? This is absolutely an intermediate step between what traditional flying and sort of autonomous, or you're in the back seat of effectively an air taxi. But it may be, from a regulatory standpoint, the step that's required in order to get us to that point. And I think it could dramatically change the way that we think about flight training. One example that comes to mind is, I've worked for a guy who said it was very important that even in a training environment that the aircraft had traditional stall, right? So you'd pull the stick all the way back and you'd get buffet and you'd get wing drop and all that sort of stuff in the traditional sense. That was important to make a great pilot one day. Well, in the context of like career track aviators, right, where they're going to go right onto the Airbus system, they may never professionally experience anything close to an aerodynamic stall. So in the same way that you could limit stall from flight training, you could limit a lot of things from flight training and maybe get rid of a lot of the burden that it takes to get to a certifiable standard as an aviator to carry that ticket. And I think that's a dramatic shift in the way that we think about both flight training and aviating in general going forward.
Okay. Well, Tim, what do you think about all this modern technology, like you see in the vans, like you see in everything Elliott was talking about, electric trainers?
There's some parts of me that are kind of have some light bulbs go in my head. I mean, I think one thing that is really important is, we do want to train the pilots to know how to stall. I think they should know how to stall. They should have that. It's really a kind of the psych picture thing. It's also a middle, like kind of feeling thing, because you kind of have that feeling in your stomach when you do the stall. And to limit them and not really have them experience that and send them to the wild, and then let's say say they are certificated to fly whatever, and under sport pilot rules they could fly 172. Well, the 172 might not have these limitations. They might not be able to limit the envelope. So you're going to have the sport pilot go out there and say, oh, well, all I got to do is pull back the stick, and then it just flies up. And they don't really know that, hey, they got to watch their airspeed, they got to do this. So I think it's kind of my, I guess, I'll say defense, but I'm like, maybe we should, not go down that route. And then the second part of that too is like, if we go to more, autonomy and all this stuff, it's kind of like the four-flight argument, or the EFB argument. It's like, well, adding this technology definitely aids in the safety of pilots, but now we're just kind of giving the control to an iPad, or in this case maybe the avionics. In this case, we're kind of lowering the competency level of our future generation of aviators. Is this innovation going in the right direction? And I think that's kind of some of the arguments that might be had from other flight school owners or other operators that are seeing these changes come through, especially with the newer generation of pilots. I think especially back in 2022, we had rushed, like, I don't know, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands, maybe even new pilots into the industry just after COVID, because there was a hiring surge. And a lot of them now are, they didn't really have the best, training experience during that time. That's what at least I'm hearing. So are we kind of lowering the safety standards? This is the main argument here by allowing all this innovation to come in. And obviously it's a give and take. I think we have to allow the innovation to happen. But to the defense of all the, maybe old school pilots, how much innovation can we bring in before we sacrifice the competency and the safetyness of each new certificated pilot?
100%. And I didn't mean to advocate for getting rid of, for instance, stall training. I think growing up, I grew up at an airport, grew up in Cubs, flying off of grass, flying tail wheelers. That's where my passion for aviation comes. But I think the reality, we used to talk about puppy mill pilots, like the guys that went through the big schools, they went to, Embry-Riddle or whatever, and those guys don't actually know anything about aviation. We can draw that line wherever we want as far as our club, our clique of what aviation is. But the reality is like the sky is an incredible empowering thing. And in order to take advantage of that third dimension, in terms of travel, in terms of taking your family around, I think is something that the world wants more of. And what now? Should they be playing in our sandbox? Should they be flying Cubs? And should they be doing acro? And should they be flying 172s? I mean, I absolutely would not advocate for that. But if that cracks the nut open and changes the access to aviation that ultimately adds up to more flight hours for the rest of us, I think we all have to think about it. And the reality is the technology's here, right? Like just like we were talking about the Tesla earlier, right? There's a computer between your steering wheel and the wheels that are on the ground. There's a computer between your throttle foot and the thruster on the ground, and that's just the reality. So I think that we would be silly not to figure out how to take advantage of that. And the question is how to do it and how to do it safely. One thing to back up and think about: we talk about how aviation is safer than driving. Well, it's safer than driving with Part 25, 10 to the minus 9 systems, right? And that is absolutely true. And we talk about the safety and whether or not your iPad you're dependent on for your life. Your iPad would not be included in the flight control laws for your Part 25, 10 to the minus 9 system. The problem I have with this moment is that we do have to lower the bar in order to sort of let the floodgates open and figure out where this tech is. But the reality is that maybe the regulators, maybe the consumers, maybe the guy with an airplane full of batteries that are flying over his head don't understand the difference between 10 to the minus 9 of that 737 and 10 to the minus 4 or 10 to the minus 3 as far as a number of cycles between failures that we may be letting into the world as we talk about Part 22 and we talk about sort of the beginnings of SVO, right? So the Garmin Autopilot is a great example, or the Autoland system is a great example, right? Those servos that drive the Autopilot in your Garmin were never designed to that 10 to the minus 9 standards. So even the Autoland system is not supposed to be deployed except for in an emergency. So you would not be able to rely on that as it sits for envelope protection at the 10 to the minus 9 level. Maybe 10 to the minus 9 is too far. Maybe that's too much of a burden for these manufacturers. Maybe it needs to come down. Maybe 10 to the minus 2 is fine because, like we're talking about, 80% of the time that Lute's been flying, it's been sport pilot related activities, and therefore maybe over rural Nebraska, and the thing can wad up in a ball in the air or turn into a ball of lithium polymer fire and not hurt anybody. But I think we're still understanding what that is, and Part 22 represents a moment where we're sort of cracking the books and figuring out a path forward to take advantage of these technologies, whatever they be and whatever they add up to.
And Tim, from a pilot training perspective, I think the standards for sport pilot are not, for the stuff that we test, is not much different than private pilot. In fact, it's mostly identical. So we're still teaching fundamental airmanship and things like that. Where Elliott's talking about going is, I think something that I've talked to a lot of my industry colleagues about as well, where maybe we do have a future someday where we pick and choose what you have to learn based on the automations that exist in your aircraft. 3-4 generations of pilots ago, everybody had to learn tailwheel because that's all we had. The nose wheel was actually the weird thing that you had to kind of learn to. So, that'll things like that'll develop in the future. But for right now, yeah, the standards are the standards, and they're quite similar to what pretty much anybody would be familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the second argument that I've heard from my CFIs, actually, not really from flight operators, is like the standards for sport pilot is almost the same as private pilot. You might as well just get the private pilot, but then I guess the defense in this maybe is the medical and all that stuff,
or the cost.
Right?
Yeah.
No, not the cost, because it's roughly the same hours. Roughly, like they're saying, it's take about 40 hours roughly to get this
in practice.
In practice,
right? You have a minimum that's low.
Yeah.
take longer.
It's still about the same. I mean,
Well, in PPL, you end up taking longer as well, right, on average. But I don't know. I mean, you're on the ground, Lou. Yeah, I see that you have some thoughts there.
I don't know. It took me 64 hours. It takes a lot of. Let's go leave the career 141 stuff aside. Just talk about GA pilots for a second. 60 plus hours. Almost everybody I know. So, but how many of us soloed at like 15 hours, right? And then how much did you fly solo? A lot, right? I flew way more solo than I needed, and that's really dangerous. It's really not much different than letting somebody get up to 20, 30 hours and getting a sport because they're missing night and a few other endorsements. I don't think it's any more dangerous than what we're already doing and how we're doing it. I mean, 15 hours of solo is crazy if you just think about 15 hours. And I've seen some do it in less. What's the difference between a kid being able to solo and continue soloing versus letting somebody operate an aircraft at 20 or 30 hours, having gone through a check ride and doing all that? I mean, I don't see the risk, and in particular with the new technology, envelope protection, glass cockpits. It's safer today. I mean, the straight and level button is like the greatest invention on earth, right? Just you get a little disoriented. We've all been there. You go reach over, push that blue button, and you're done. I've done it twice in instrument training where I'm like, all right, I'm overwhelmed. I need to. Tower's talking to me.
That sounds so
I'm
sick.
climbing. I gotta push the
level
button.
Shoot.
Yeah, you need a straight level button, Tim.
You're converting it.
Yeah, I want a straight level button right now.
when you're training in your low time, I mean, it can be the difference between getting really disoriented or overwhelmed or having a bad experience and just taking a chill pill.
Sounds like you're advocating for some discipline, though, in utilizing those safeguards, Lou. I mean, you said you used it twice. So you're saying maybe you don't want to be so trigger happy with those things. You use them when you're saturated, in those critical moments. So, what would you say to those people who are saying, oh, we're going soft, with all this tech? What happens if you suddenly remove it? Does that mean that you can't get yourself out of a hairy situation? I mean, what would you say to the people who are worried about that?
I would say it's really not a question of going soft. It's more of a question of making aviation available to more GA people with the cost getting absolutely out of hand without selling these safety features and all this great new advancement. Somebody may just not do it. They're like, you know what, it just sounds too, it's too risky. I just want to fly to the lake and play golf, right? And so you might just push people away if we keep hanging on to the old way. And I liked Elliott's Tesla analogy earlier. I'm a big Tesla guy. I've owned one for a long time. And people flipped out when autopilot. Now every autopilot I've driven, I hold to Tesla's standard of autopilot because it's the best one. So I don't think it's any different than the technology in the automotive industry. People are going to have a reaction, but if we don't do something, all of us in the industry, GA aviation will die. We are all at airports where Saturday used to be humming and hangars were open, planes are in the air, and now it is nothing. Between insurance and fuel, you actually have to be wealthy to enjoy aviation now, and that sucks.
Yeah, I think that's the number one barrier is the cost here, and for operators, this is kind of the devil's advocate argument here. I'm actually a pro for this MOSAIC stuff. I actually think that I'm looking forward to a lot of these new aircrafts coming out. I'm looking forward to more people getting in the industry with a sport pilot license and being able to fly around the airport. I think it's what we need for GA. In the short term, however, the costs are relatively same, I would say, or maybe So let's just take this for example. You buy a brand new I don't know, maybe Sling or I don't know, maybe a Vans. It says 200, 300 grand. I mean, you could still buy a clapped out 172 1970s, for $80K. You can get 2-3 of these for the same price of a new one. So, I mean, I get it for a brand new Cessna 172, it's $500,000, 600, maybe $700,000. But on the other hand, if you're running a flight training operation, you need more planes and you need butts in the seats. So it's easy to just get 2 Piper Cherokees versus 1, Vans. I don't know. Maybe I'm correct.
Tim, you're right, but somebody said it earlier. these students, in particular, the ones going career track, are demanding better avionics. They need to learn in what they're going to be flying. And you get an $80,000 Cessna, and you're going to spend $100,000 getting it right.
Put a GPX in there.
Yeah, well, yes, you're almost to a new Vans or comparable aircraft when you start adding in all the stuff you need. And then of course you want it to be nice, and you need nice autopilot and some paint, and I mean you're there. So not to mention, I mean, we're keep talking about fuel because I'm so aggravated with the fuel prices, not to mention the efficiencies in fuel. I don't love to jump into new tech just for the sake of it. I'm having a hard time hanging on to the old method of the old aircraft. I'm having a real difficult time hanging on to those legacy mentality.
But I want to make the most of the time that we have left. And before we kind of jump to Tom and Hans about what it means to do advocacy in aviation and how flight school owners can get involved to solve, the long list of problems that they may be having in the flight training space. Last thing on fuel and on cost and stuff, Elliott, what does electric mean for the future of cost efficiency in aviation? And also, like, realistically, when can we expect those things to no longer be theoretical? You know what I mean?
Yeah, the magic is all the batteries, and you'll hear that everywhere you go. But cost of energy, you're looking at 80% of the cost of buying 100 low lead. So 80% reduction. So 20% of the cost of energy just to fill the tank. And then the question just comes down to, for instance, how many cycles can you get out of a battery, and then how hard can you hit the battery, and therefore how much extra battery you have to haul around in order to not hit the battery so hard. But it's a significant reduction.
And so the second part was, when can we kind of realistically, when does Lute sign up, So,
Sign me up, Ellie. I want an early adopter.
That's right. No, I dig the enthusiasm. I think certification path at BI right now, we're looking at sort of the 12 months range on the fastest we could do it. It may extend beyond that, as of course there's some risks even with 22 of understanding what that certification environment looks like. But yeah, the market response has been tremendous. There's, I think, 1,500 orders for the eFlyer 2 already been taken. The market wants it, and cost of energy is a significant player, so it could be exciting.
I do want to just mention one other thing. This is not necessarily super relevant to flight schools, but one other area where electric makes a ton of sense is those ironically, it's the stuff that we originally did light sport for back in 2004. It's the really, really light, I'm just going to go up for an hour at sunset kind of stuff, where you're not going up for very long. Man, things like Challenger 2s and Quicksilvers, a lot of those original designs depended on 2-cycle engines that are really hard to find these days. Electric can work really well and is super reliable for that kind of stuff. So there's some excitement there too.
I want to be respectful of the time. So I know we have about 18, 20 people all watching live with us over there. So if you do have questions, please filter them to the chat channel. We are about to kind of conclude here. So I want to kind of go around the room here, and maybe each one of our panelists can probably give maybe one sentence or a paragraph about, just their thoughts, closing thoughts and remarks, any call to actions you guys might have before we kind of leave here. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah, totally. Let's do it. What MOSAIC means, especially for flight schools and flight training organizations. And like Tim said, any call to actions that you might have for them.
Don't come all Russian now.
We can go in the same order as we did at the beginning. We can do Tom, then Hans, then Lute, then Elliott.
All right. Well, I think to sum it up, MOSAIC means more people hopefully can become pilots, remain pilots, and teach people to fly. From a pilot perspective and from a flight school and aircraft perspective, it opens up innovation and it makes new aircraft more affordable. That's really the bottom line there, and we need to build upon that success for the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's basically what I was going to say. MOSAIC really just opens up innovation for all kinds of new aircraft, more capable airplanes at lower prices, and that's across the board. That's for private owners. That's for flight training, everything that fits into the new light sport category.
Yeah, I think my 2 cents would be everybody needs to relax and
Relax,
stop
guys.
worrying so
Relax.
much. Everybody relax. I mean, listen, we still have DPEs doing their job. We still have CFIs doing their job. There's still the human element in here of there's a responsible party to make sure we're not signing off on people that are going to be dangerous or take on risks. So we're not changing the whole system. We're just improving some of the more technical aspects of it, and that's cool. I like that.
I think he froze last minute. Uh-oh.
There, Elliott, you still there with us?
Oh, he just left. Okay.
I'm here.
I saw there it is. He's back online.
So I think Tom brought up, flying a cub off grass, and that deep connection that we feel here in the United States to aviation and what's turned into our career paths. I think a lot of that hinges on the fact that there was a time when the United States was sort of the Wild West, literally, and aviation was able to take a firm root here, and it was accentuated by years of us being technological leaders in the world and bringing new technology to the space. I think what Part 22 represents for me, and MOSAIC represents for me, is the FAA saying that they're on board to make sure that we continue to be the leaders in aerospace on the planet, to make sure that awesome technology not only operates here, not only trains students here, but is developed here and continues to grow here. And it's very exciting, and I'm excited about that future.
Awesome. Thanks for kicking it off on such a passionate note, Elliott. Thank you for joining us at 3 a.m, where you are currently in the Philippines. And thanks to all of you guys really for making the time to join me and Tim for this conversation. I know you guys are busy. You guys are super knowledgeable on MOSAIC and what it means for the future. You're all invited to the podcast, by the way, even though Lute, you've been there once before. I hope that you come again. And Tim, you want to kick it off with some call to actions here?
Yeah. I also want to say thank you to the audience members as well. We had about 20 at the highest here listening on here. So if you are part of the community, welcome. If you're not, if you're listening to this post recording and all that type of stuff, plug in, guys. I mean, Red Rudder Marketing is all about aviation. It's all about flight training and pilots. We have our webinar series. We talk about how to grow flight school businesses. We have the podcast, Aviation Business Podcast. We interview tons of people on there, flight school owners. We talk to, software people, leaders in the industry. We talked to even insurance the other day, I think, as well on the podcast. So if you want to be a guest, check it out, redruddermarketing.com, aviationbusinesspodcast.com as well. Give us a call, 314-804-1200. There's also info@redruddermarketing.com. But yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody that's been listening on here, whether you're in your car like Mary, she driving away, or you're at home or at the flight schools or whatever. Thank you so much for plugging in. We really appreciate you guys. Stay tuned for more. See you guys around.